Welcome back to College Football Addiction, back with Tom Hannifan, State of State podcast, and Believe in Big Ten. Tom, I appreciate your time today. Let's talk a little bit about Penn State's expectations in 2025. We already spoke about Jim Knowles at length, and I'll link that video at the end for anybody that may have missed it. But you said something interesting to me in that video where this feels like kind of an all-in year for Penn State, but this move may not signify that it's just a one-off year. This may just be the trend going forward for Penn State. Hey, we're going to compete at the biggest level. And obviously the questions around that will be answered in years to come. But it kind of feels like this might just be Penn State saying, look, we're going to win one of these things. We're going to take it home. It's not just a one-year thing, although this year it feels very one-in-ish with what they bring back on offense, bringing in Jim Knowles. But it might signify something even bigger.
Yeah, time will tell whether or not this is going to be an indicator of consistent spending at this level. And I think if that is the case, then James Franklin and Pat Kraft will have won a major battle within the Penn State ecosystem. For a very long time, there has been the phrase success with honor at Penn State. A lot of that is tied to Joe Paterno and the concept of, hey, you should want to come here and have what James Franklin refers to as a transformational opportunity, not necessarily transactional. And so many people within the Penn State community have been staunchly against the movement of NIL, transfer portal, paying players, because they have felt for a long time that that's just not what Penn State does. Michigan had a similar battle, but obviously overcame that. It makes me hopeful that giving Jim Knowles $3.1 million on average over 3 years is an indicator that you're now going to start doing this when it comes to players, because how many times have the national media and local media talked about Penn State's wide receivers are pedestrian. They need upgrades at that position. They need upgrades at a handful of positions going into 2025. But the nucleus that they return from 2024 is outstanding. Andy Kolnicki, quarterback Drew Allar, running backs Nick Singleton and Katron Allen. The list goes on and on. Denied Dennis Sutton at defensive end, Zane Duran at defensive tackle, Zakee Wheatley at safety. I mean, there's a wonderful nucleus that you're maintaining, plus the upgraded defensive coordinator. So for me, it's a big question going forward if Penn State's going to be prepared to leave that old, archaic, tradition-based line of thinking in the past and be like, hey, this is what it takes to be competitive at this point in the lifetime of college football. You're either going to pay up or you're going to fall behind. And I give a lot of credit to Pat Kraft and James Franklin for slowly winning over hearts and minds to get to the point where you can give a coordinator $3+ million.
Yeah. We talked in the Jim Knowles specific video about, just very briefly, the motivation that he will certainly have for at least one game, and not that he won't be motivated for all 12 and beyond.
Right.
But that trip back to Columbus, and you were mentioning wide receivers, if there was a wide receiver in the portal that you wanted to snag, maybe you could pony up for that from the same roster that from which you took Jim Knowles. But that trip to Columbus, and that to me, it feels like such a linchpin game, right? It feels like, and not to overlook the other opponents on the schedule by any means, but it feels like when you go all in, the goal is to win a national title, right? And I know Ohio State dealt with this too. You lose to your biggest rival, but then you end up, your consolation prize is just a gold trophy at the end of the year. You might take that trade. Maybe Ohio State fans are still pissed off about what happened the last Saturday after Thanksgiving, but it does feel like that is the hump that Penn State has to clear. And winning the national title, so much of that is seeding and luck and can you get hot at the right time and all those other things. But the one thing they can control is a trip to Columbus. And that comes early. That is something that there will be a million storylines around because of who the new defensive coordinator is. But when you talk about expectations, I think you almost have to start there. And it would surprise me if Penn State's not an underdog in that game, a game in Columbus where they're never an underdog. But it, to me, feels like that's the linchpin of what our expectations are at Penn State. It's what happens that Saturday.
I agree with you. It's been nearly a decade since Penn State beat Ohio State in football. I think also Justin King and I have talked about this on State of State, is that opponents can create challenges before you even step on the field. We talked about going into the Big Ten championship game, and Penn State doesn't have any ghosts in its past when it comes to Oregon. So why would you walk into that game being scared of them, or, oh, we can't get past these guys. That's not been your experience. The experience for the Penn State football fan base, the program, period, has been we can't seem to beat Ohio State and or Michigan. So when you're getting recruited to Penn State, when you finally come aboard at Penn State, when you're a student applying and, all these little things, that's all you hear. And it's impossible to avoid it no matter what the program does behind closed doors and trying to be 1-0, and we take everything one step at a time. Of course, that proverbial monkey is on your back. So if Penn State was able to, one, beat Ohio State in 2025, it'd be incredible. To do it at home in Columbus against the Buckeyes coming off of a national championship, it would be a paradigm shift for this program. And the fascinating thing about all this, there's still people knocking Ohio State for the greatest roster that money could buy. And then it'll be knocking Penn State potentially if that were to happen. Oh, it's the greatest coaching staff money could buy. That's the sport now. That's the game. Again, you either adapt or die. And that's what we're living in right now. And Penn State is choosing to adapt.
It is funny to hear people say that like we ever existed in college football without teams with elite resources won national championships. I think now that it's just out in front of us and we can look at it and we can see it, it feels a little bit more like that. But Alabama wasn't winning national titles on a shoestring budget, right?
No.
Georgia didn't moneyball their way to national championships, right?
I think that the death penalty that SMU suffered was the end of players getting paid. You're an idiot. Open your eyes.
Yeah. So it is funny to hear people, oh man, now they're just buying players. And I'm just like, do you remember what Tennessee was doing? And they weren't even winning, but they were literally McDonald's bagging their way to try and win SEC games.
What do you think Ole Miss has been doing now for the longest time?
Yeah.
Come on.
Auburn with Hugh Freeze there, right? Like, yeah, this is not a new thing, right? So, so anyway, ESPN put out a projection that has Penn State winning this thing.
Yeah, I saw that.
The whole thing.
How can you throw the whole bracket together in freaking January of 25? I mean, who in their right mind would have expected SMU, Arizona State, and Boise State to be, one, in the playoff, and then two, seated where they were seated? I gave that no thought whatsoever, but I do think Penn State, yes, has a very good, very strong chance of competing for the national championship next year.
Yeah, your January 28th in 2025 projections for what will happen literally a year from now are absurd, but the expectations are, I don't know, if you're James Franklin, do you like that expectation? Do you like being the underdog that nobody really expected this year, had a path that set up well, but like, do you like being that underdog that's just a play away from the national championship game? Or do you like that you can kind of sell to your team, look, guys, I told you we would get here. I told you they'd start talking about us. I told you that eventually this would come if you came and played for me or if you chose to stick around or whatever. Do you kind of like that expectation or is the pressure too much or maybe a little bit of both?
From what I understand about James Franklin, the 1-0 mentality is very real, and that anytime players have spoken up or gotten a little bit, excited or something like that in the media and talked about, oh, we're going to win a Big Ten title, we're going to be in the playoff, we're going to win the national championship, you immediately then hear James Franklin be like, yeah, I got to have a conversation with him. That's not been his messaging for his time at Penn State. It's let's win the next game, period. However, you and Pat Kraft clearly just had conversations about what do we do, what gets us over the hump to win the national championship, and especially in regard to this defensive coordinator hire and grabbing Jim Knowles from Ohio State. The thought process there 100% was, what is the dollar amount that is going to get us closer to a national title? So clearly that thought process is happening. I am very, very interested to hear the next time that James Franklin is able to speak with the media and field those questions, because it's going to be hard for him to say no. I don't expect him to flat out say, yep, it's national championship or bust in 2025. That's not his style. It's now tempering expectations. And also the flip side of all this, 2024 was proof of performance for Penn State, proof of productivity, that you can make it to the Final Four of the college football playoff, and you're a field goal away from making the national championship. People can knock the games against SMU and Boise State. I completely understand that. Still, you were this close to competing for a national championship. So now the pressure is on James Franklin of, Is it boom or bust in 2025? But also, it's like all these resources have been handed to you. This is probably your last year. I think your last year with Drew Aller, Nick Singleton, and Katron Allen. A lot of other pieces that are going to be really valuable. Does Penn State have a dip in 2026, just in terms of personnel, or are they now, because of obviously an added focus on this program in terms of spending? Do they turn their fortunes around for 2026 in terms of recruiting, transfer portal, all those sorts of things? It's a lot of big questions, but it does feel like now is the time to win a national championship for the first time in nearly 40 years at Penn State.
Fans are not reasonable ever. And
Never.
so I think
No.
I know the answer to this question. Does the fan base feel like it's national championship or bust? Do they feel like you've got to win it? Or, if you got to the Final Four again, I mean, because it takes some luck. It takes some getting hot at the right time. Like winning a championship is just so much harder today. And having to win 4 games or 3 if you get the bye, to me, it is so much harder today than it's ever been. Not only do you have to get through a 13-game schedule if you make the Big Ten championship unscathed, you got to win 3 or 4 more games. But is the fan base reasonable at all, or is it, man, we gotta hold that trophy up at the end of the year?
Penn State fans are, understanding to a fault, but I think the general temperature of the room is Penn State needs to win the national championship in 2025. It's boom or bust. I think that's the way the Penn State fan base feels at this point in time. Part of that is fatigue with James Franklin. The question continues to be from Penn State fans, how many more resources do you need, James? But it's also a lack of transparency in terms of like, hey, we needed to fix the training table situation. It wasn't even in the football building. So getting that in the building. James Franklin famously was talking about the State College Airport this past year and that the runway is not big enough for them to get a plane that'll fly them from State College to Los Angeles, for instance, to play USC. All these little things do add up in terms of the infrastructure of a college football program, but it really does feel like this is the year. And again, I come back to the personnel side of this. Drew Aller is out after this coming year. I fully expect him to be off to the NFL draft. I don't know if he has a 5th year of eligibility. I can't remember, to be honest. But I expect Drew Aller, Nick Singleton, Katron Allen to be done after this coming season. Your window is now. You have to take advantage of this, because now this is the team that made it as far as it did and showed a lot of ability and was able to get to that point. Drew Aller, to me, is going to be the pivot point for this entire football team, because he can't be deer in headlights against Notre Dame. Drew Aller in 2025, he has to be the guy that engineered the comeback victory against USC. That's the guy that everybody believes he can be. That's why a lot of people see him as a top 10 pick, top 5 pick, number 1 overall pick in an eventual NFL draft. That is going to be a major, major focus point for Penn State.
Tom, where can people follow you? Where can they get more of your work?
Yeah, check out State of State, a Penn State football show with myself and former Penn State and NFL defensive back Justin King, wherever you get your podcast. Check out Believe in Big Ten with myself and former Indiana wide receiver Rhett Lewis, also representing the Big Ten Network and NFL Network. That's wherever you get your podcast. And you can check me out on Instagram and X at Tom Hannifan, TomHannifan.
Awesome, man. I appreciate you a ton for hanging out.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it.